Adventures in Consciousness by Jane Roberts. Part 1. Adventures. Chapter 1. The Class That Went Too Far. Seth and Alterations of Consciousness. The story behind aspect psychology began with a series of events that I couldn't deny or explain to my satisfaction. Intuitively, I was intrigued. Intellectually, I was scandalized. I admit this freely because it was my incessant questioning that finally led me to keep notes of everything that went on in my expansion of consciousness class, records that I'm using now in writing this book. The June 21st class in 1971 stands out in my mind as the turning point. We weren't involved in scientifically oriented experiments that could be checked out in one way or another. Instead, we were dealing with psychological events of a most unusual nature. These were either extraordinary perceptions or hallucinations in response to group suggestion, or they fell in some strange area in between the two. I'm a private type person. For the first year of my class, I wouldn't even go into a Seth trance. Now I really enjoy such spontaneous sessions. One minute I'm me, sitting there, and the next minute I sense an opening, like a psychological door, and I walk into it and become Seth. It's something like an astronaut's launching window in a way. My reality lines up with something else, and an exchange takes place. I step aside to an invisible holding position, and Seth is where I was. This particular class was small, about 15 people. Seth came through early in the evening and led them in an exercise in alteration of consciousness. Speaking for him, my voice often becomes quite deep, and sometimes it's of considerable volume, so it can be quite a shock for people used to quiet-voiced spirit guides. In previous classes, Seth had given arbitrary names to various levels of consciousness, just to help us pinpoint the different subjective states involved. Each seems to have its own characteristics and accompanying alterations of perception. That night, the psychological journey was to be Alpha 2, which is the second stage adjacent to normal consciousness. While Seth gave the simple instructions, students' recorders buzzed and traffic sounds rushed up from the corner intersection below. The living room lights were on, but people put down their wine glasses and cigarettes and closed their eyes. Listening to Seth's voice, they focused less and less on the smoky room and exterior environment. Instead, they peered into inner landscapes and turned corners of consciousness that intersect only in the world of mind. Seth comes through as a very energetic personality, so while he gave his instructions, his eyes were open and his voice was strong and emphatic. First, he told students to think of Alpha 2 as a door. I want you to realize that your perceptions at this point are limited only because you have chosen to limit them, he said. You are in the midst of other realities, but you are in the habit of blocking them out. You are now beginning to release your perceptions to open doors that have been closed. Therefore, Imagine Alpha 2 as a doorway adjacent to your normal consciousness and see it open. Seth went on to say that each person would interpret the experience in his or her own way. Beyond the door are other realities and people with whom you have always been acquainted. I want you to freely open your inner eyes. Walk with joy within these other realities that exist as surely as this room does. Open your inner senses and direct them along these lines. The physical body will not hamper you. In fact, it will help you, for hidden even within the flesh are mechanisms that aid the inner senses in their functioning. I want you to realize that you are getting glimpses of a reality that is instantaneous and as much a part of you as your own heartbeat. You can learn to manipulate in that environment. Then Seth asked students to pause a while at that threshold of consciousness and to imagine still another door, or if you prefer, a path, avenue, landscape, or alley, but still another reality that opens up adjacently from your present level. From this new viewpoint, you can sense other probabilities that you, yourself, have brought into existence. I want you to feel their strength and vitality, and to realize that they also reinforce your own life. Seth continued to explain this level of consciousness for a few moments and asked students to pause there. Then he said, "Now, I want those of you who can to follow still further, for we will travel beyond these fields of probabilities in which all times are born, into another in which times are not manufactured, and hours or years of any kind do not exist. Here, in your terms, all probabilities are as yet unborn, while in greater terms they are already accomplished, and yet coming into fresh existence. You also have a reality here, and this dimension nurses your own world, reaching down into your own system. These realities are still only those at the edge of the one in which you have your present existence. For beyond are others, so alien to you that I could not explain them. Yet they are connected with your own life, and they find expression even within the smallest cells of your flesh." I've only given the general highlights here of Seth's instructions. He spent quite a bit of time guiding students back to their normal state of consciousness, for example, and teaching them to retrace their mental footwork. Still, the entire episode took less than a half hour. I came out of trance easily, as usual, and the students told me what happened. I rarely remember exactly what Seth says, though I think that I'm aware of each word as Seth speaks it. The word exists in a special charged now, so that when the instant is gone, so is the word or any sense of continuity. Everyone reported feelings of refreshment and realization at the Alpha 2 level, but several people had vivid, even startling experiences. 2 in particular impressed me and sent up a whirl of questions. My friend Sue Watkins hesitantly described seeing a man very clearly. She seemed to be standing with him on a flat plain. She saw a lake and some buildings beyond, and as she listened, she heard Seth's voice as if it were coming from a great distance. The man told her that his name was Jason, and that he had known her in past lives. All the while, Sue was conscious of the directions that Seth was giving. When he said to imagine Alpha 2 as a doorway, Sue saw a door that opened and a three-dimensional pyramid of light. Sue was securely in this scene, not viewing it from the outside, and everything seemed physical and real. Suddenly, Seth's voice seemed even further away, and she realized that he was ending the exercise. What would happen, she wondered, if she tried to bring Jason back with her? The two of them retraced their steps back to the door, but when she went through it, Jason was gone. When she was finished telling about the episode, Sue said almost defiantly, "He wore a long robe or gown, too." But we grinned at each other. Sue's much like I am in one respect. We give ourselves a lot of intuitive or psychic freedom, and then end up trying to make intellectual sense out of what's happened. Yet both of us were disquieted. Long-robed spirit guides? It was somehow too pat, and the name Jason was suspiciously romantic. Yet it was Sue's experience. It happened whether we approved or not, and at that level of consciousness, the experience was valid. We'd yet to understand the terms of that validity. The other dramatic event happened to a young man I'll call Joel. In the Alpha 2 state, he found himself involved with a band of Christians heading south across Europe on the way to the Crusades. They came upon a group of wandering Muslims, and Joel found himself in the middle of a fierce battle. He was quite white-faced as he told us about it. It was terribly clear, too clear, he said. In the beginning, the fields were fresh and green, and when it was all over, the ground was gouged up with blood everywhere. I saw horses just cut up. Somehow, somewhat shaken, he added that the Christians had fought with savagery, and at the end of the experience, he'd seen a monk come out of a nearby monastery and stand there grieving. All of us knew that Joel had recently left the ministry. Was this a symbolic statement of his own feelings dramatized at another level of consciousness? Was it a legitimate glimpse into his own reincarnational past? Or was it a brief backward look into history, a psychological snapshot of a vanished time? We discussed the various possibilities, then took a half-hour break. I intended to continue the discussion when class resumed, but changed my plans when I felt that Seth wanted to speak. This time one of those odd transitions took place in which another level of activity is triggered, and I speak for Seth too. In our terms, this is a future Seth, or Seth at another stage of development. Seth too comes through rarely, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Just before this transition, Seth said, "I want to give you a brief moment in which you sense, to some extent, the vast distances in which your own reality has its meaning, and the other dimensions of existence in which you also have your part." Then my face emptied of all the characteristic Seth expressions. His normal gestures stopped. There is an emptiness about my body at such times. I always feel that I leave it, moving quickly toward a pyramid shape that extends above me to some vast distance. Contact seems to take place out there. Then there is a moment or so before the voice starts. This one light, very faint, and unemotional. Students say it reminds them of what mathematical figures would sound like if they could talk. After Seth too speaks, it takes me a few minutes to come back. While with Seth, the transition is almost instantaneous. But this time I returned easily, as if down a chute of consciousness. Class was obviously excited and impressed, but when the students told me what Seth too had said, I had mixed feelings. This is the part of the message that bothered me. Certain translations are being made for you so that these communications make sense. Our energy forms worlds. We help you maintain your lives as you help maintain other existences of which you have no conscious knowledge. We watch you as you watch others, yet so vast is the distance that communication is difficult. We do not watch as human forms. You perceive us that way in distorted view. In your terms, our forms would be geometrical. We do not understand the nature of the reality you are creating, even though the seeds were given to you by us. We respect it and revere it. Do not let the weak sounds of this voice confuse you. The strength behind it would form the world as you know it and sustain it for centuries. The Seth 2 voice went on to say that we were being observed, but that there was nothing to prevent us from observing our observers in whatever way we could. In fact, we were being invited to do so. Students played the recording of the message back for me. As always, I was struck by the difference between Seth and Seth 2. The very sound of the emotionless, faint words suggested the distance between me and whatever it really was that I contacted. There was no time for quiet analysis just then, though, because everyone was talking at once. 2 students had seen a pyramid over my head, saying that it had vanished only when I came out of trance. Several persons insisted that, during the entire performance, they'd seen 3-dimensional blurred faces around the ceiling of the room. Others reported sensing the faces, but not actually seeing them. Everyone was emphatic about one thing. Seen or unseen, the room had been crowded with other consciousnesses besides our own. The room was in mild uproar. Some people were writing down their impressions on the spot. Others were checking with their neighbors. I heard someone say, "I don't care, I saw what I saw." I was disconcerted, wondering what had actually happened. Quickly, I called the class to order and said that we'd better ask ourselves how much suggestion might have been responsible for the faces on the ceiling and the related phenomena. I got a rather indignant response. For one thing, as several people pointed out, the lights had all been on and everyone's eyes had been open. No one had said a thing until afterward. The people who saw the faces didn't know that other students sensed faces in the same place, or any place for that matter. Certainly many were in an altered state of consciousness, and it's precisely at such times that our perceptions can show us data that isn't usually perceivable. I was still questioning the students when something else caught my attention. First dimly, then more vividly, I began to sense the presence of an invisible personality beside me. That is, I didn't see him, but felt his emotional reality quite as strongly as physical vision could ever show it. I'd met this same person in several previous classes when he told me mentally that he'd represented a past life of mine. Then, supposedly, I'd been some kind of jealous leader, demanding utmost loyalty. My friend Sue had been one of my followers. Now he wanted to confront her, feeling that she was going her own way this time and not following in his footsteps, as he thought she should have. What to do? I tried to be spontaneous in class, at least within reason, so I said, "Sue, that other me is here." I laughed, only to me it wasn't my laugh, but his, richly sardonic, indulgent, and amused all at once. I felt a strange facial expression from the inside and realized that my features were adapting it. Sue just stared at me. "Yeah, I know he's here, and I wish he'd go away," she said. At the same time, I began to feel much bigger and stronger than I am, physically, as this other personality really began to rouse himself. An anger against Sue, that certainly wasn't mine, rushed through me. He wanted to confront her directly, speaking through me. That wasn't fair, I thought. If he had a score to settle, he should contact the person Sue had been. Sue and I, as ourselves, would have nothing to do with it. So, firmly, I tried to hold myself aloof, and to end the matter, I called out, "Time for a class break, everybody." But I didn't quite make it. As people began to mill about, I heard that laugh, that wasn't mine, directed at Sue again. "I've looked at you with this expression on my face many times," I said. "You should know it well." Sue cried out, of all things, "I've got a 2-year-old offender this time," meaning her child, and I answered scornfully, "That's one of the most foolish remarks you could have made to me." But now I decided that the affair had gone too far. I didn't approve of this other self's grand manner or the tricky way he tried to come through, but my attitude toward him was plain. So this time I closed off completely. It's just a matter of really saying no and meaning it, and I realized that earlier I'd only half wanted to end the confrontation. I'd wanted to close the personality out enough to prevent his speaking, but not enough to prevent me from probing into his reality. Now he just disappeared entirely. "We're going to have to work that through sometime," Sue said. "Yeah, but let's wait," I answered, and we grinned at each other, both content to let the episode rest. The post-break dialogue only lasted a few minutes, and during break, the students were discussing what had happened earlier. Some were still finishing the notes they began before. It was getting late. When class resumed, Seth came through, apparently just to say good evening, but even he allowed himself to become sidetracked. "I do indeed bid you good evening," he said. "The experiment continues, and it will continue as you go about your daily chores this week. Now, there is nothing to prevent you from watching the watchers. In fact, you should find this most intriguing." According to class, Seth was about to close the session when a student I'll call Ron interrupted to ask a question. Somebody made a mock moan. Ron was known for getting tangled up in his own questions. He also considered himself quite an intellectual, took himself very seriously, and loved to pose questions for Seth. He was really a very nice young man with a lot to learn, though, and Seth usually treated him kindly, with an amused, tolerant air. This particular evening, however, the whole class was still highly curious about Seth II's message and their own impressions. They were particularly intrigued by the implications of the experiment, and by now they were all in a very serious mood. When Ron asked his question, Seth took him on with a kind of humor that instantly cleared the air. There's nothing like a good laugh to return us solidly to the world that we know and plank us back onto the firm framework of our own emotions. Ron's actual question was voiced like this: do you see, in other words, when Jane is speaking, can you see the room? Or do you only see the room? Ron paused and wet his lips, then said, "Did you see what I'm getting at?" Seth said, "When I am speaking, I cause myself to concentrate on this minute portion of time and space that you think of as this room. Otherwise, I can look at you, seeing your reincarnational existences, for example, and I am not limited to perceiving only the one self you imagine yourself to be." "Would you be aware of, say, the pot on the table?" Ron asked. "Only if I were interested in the pot on the table." As Seth, I was smiling broadly. "But how would it appear to you?" Ron persisted. "As a pot on the table," Seth said sardonically. Ron frowned. "The same way it would appear," Seth said, "when I use perceptions in your reality, then I automatically translate inner data into physical terms. Otherwise, I am not limited to that kind of perception." Smiling, speaking very slowly for effect, he added, "I need not perceive that object as a pot, but I can perceive it as a pot. You must perceive it as a pot. And now I am saying good evening." "But you didn't answer my question," Ron said stubbornly. "I did indeed. You did not listen to the answer. Your questions obsess you, and you do not listen." Ron came out with another garbled version of what he was trying to say. He was growing red-faced, but even more determined. Seth said, with a note of finality, "The reality of the pot on the table, as you know it, is a portion of my entire perception of it." Very soberly, Ron said, "You answered the question. I understand." "Thank you," Seth said, so dryly that the students all broke out laughing. Even Ron started grinning. He didn't feel put down either, but vindicated because he felt that he'd held his own just the same. Seth made a few general remarks, then said, "Now again, I bid you a fond good evening, and remember that the experiment continues." People were still excited, but the dialogue between Seth and Ron had put the evening back into a more normal perspective. Yet, by the end of class, I didn't know what to think. At least a part of me wished that Seth too hadn't come through at all. Most of all, I wish that people hadn't reported seeing faces on the ceiling. I just didn't believe that beings from another reality were peeking into my living room. I didn't like the emotional confrontation with Sue either, particularly since I wasn't sure if I regarded reincarnation as a fact or as a symbol for something else. Yet something happened. People perceived certain data. Even in terms of altered perception alone, the evening's events were significant. At the time, though, those events seemed so intellectually unrespectable to me that I put the class notes aside, unable to grapple with their implications. What bothered me was the lack of a suitable framework in which to assess what happened. What we had was a group of psychological events and perceptions that would be treated with scorn by many people. Yet this was human experience. Joel would remember the frightening battle on the grassy plains long after he forgot the facts of the day, such as what he'd eaten for breakfast or what suit he'd worn. Sue would recall her memory of Jason and her attempt to bring him back into the room long after other more valid events had been forgotten. Why should we be afraid of our own experience because it seems strange in the eyes of the world, or because we're afraid that it might? Why are we so worried about an intellectual respectability when it implies limitation of perception, or when we must scale down our own experience to fit preconceived notions? I think we react this way, many of us, because we've been warned so often since childhood not to trust our imagination or intuitions, and to judge our perceptions constantly against a definite world of facts. And this world of facts was set before us as the only criterion of reality. A lie, after all, is an untruth, something said that did not happen in a world of facts. So by implication almost, there's a moral connotation connected when we see something others don't see. Someone must be lying. If we can say that suggestions operated, then we're at least half safe. For we mean that we were lying, but not on purpose. We thought we saw what we did, but we were mistaken. Of course, suggestion operates, but no one is really sure what suggestion is. Besides, perceptions directly caused by suggestion in usual terms may still be as valid as any others. Our very perception of the physical world is caused by suggestion given to us by our senses. Even a slight alteration of consciousness causes us to experience events in a different fashion. On the one hand, I knew this, but on the other hand, I was still trying to relate my experiences to a framework too small to contain them. I kept going over the events in my mind. The emotional power and interchange between Sue and my other personality was definite. Were Sue and I unconsciously acting out inner feelings toward each other that needed release? Was that all? A dramatized encounter with both of us unaware consciously of the inner mechanisms involved? If so, the episode was certainly therapeutic and creative. Why wasn't that enough? Because it purported to be something else, of course. Was all of this true or false? Did Joel relive a portion of a past life experience, or didn't he? Was there actually Were there actually faces on the ceiling, or weren't there? So the evening's events sent me into a whirl of intellectual questioning, in which it seemed at times that my intellect and intuitions were at odds. It took a while before they began to merge in a new synthesis that would lead me to aspect psychology, and a framework in which such events could comfortably be considered, a framework large enough to contain the meaning of all of our experiences. As my intellect and intuitions worked together, they led me to discover an inner order of events and introduced me to alternate realities, each with their own laws, so that the facts in one system may seem quite senseless in the other. But I didn't know that then. I only knew that I would insist on allowing myself psychic and intuitive freedom while using my intellect to criticize the results. Because until a short time ago, I still shared with many others the belief that the intellect's main function was a critical one, operating separate and apart from intuitive levels of the self. The volumes of Seth material, all dictated in trance, should have taught me otherwise, since there the intellect and psychic are so beautifully blended. But even in 1971, I was scrutinizing Seth from the standpoint of true or false, and to a large extent I was blinded to his greater reality by trying to understand it in too small a context. End of chapter 1.